Well, good morning, everyone. It's a couple minutes past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the TAC meeting today, which is Monday, April 4th. Hopefully you are having a great week live because this is your first meeting. You did not go into the office early. So I'm going to turn it over to Jordan for a roll call if I'm.
From Spotsylvania County, online we have Paul Agnello, Mr. Rodney White.
Here.
Mr. Jacob Paswick. Online, we have Mr. Mohammed Ben Amar. From the city of Fredericksburg, Ms. Janie Jackson.
Here.
Mr. Bassam Amin.
Here.
Mr. Craig Pennington. From Stafford County, Mr. Alex Oziak.
Here.
Mr. Brandon Brown.
Here.
Mr. Brian Council. From King George County, Mr. Nick Minor.
Here.
Ms. Kimberly Wilson. From Caroline County, Mr. Mike Fincham. Mr. Craig Pennington. From FHWA, Mr. Ivan Rucker. From the Virginia Department of Transportation, online we have Amy Gabarini and Ms. Sierra Williams. From the Virginia Department of Transportation, Ms. Michelle Shropshire. Here. Mr. Stephen Haynes.
Here.
Mr. Jim Ponticello. Mr. Dan Grinnell. From the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission, PRTC, Dr. Bob Schneider. Mr. Joe Stainsby. From the Virginia Railway Express, online we have Ms. Christine Hefner and then Mr. Nick Ruiz.
Here.
From Fred Regional Transit, Mr. Aiden Cork.
He's on his way.
All right. And then Mr. Craig Reed. From GW Ride Connect, Ms. Kate Gibson. Here. Ms. Lee Anderson. The roll call has been conducted and the quorum is present.
All right, thank you. All right, so the next item up is the approval of our minutes. Actually, the agenda first. So can I get a motion to approve the minutes, the agenda?
So moved.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Brandon.
All right, next up is the approval of the March 7th TAC minutes. I'll give you a second to review those if you have not already. And if it's administrative in nature, you can send folks an email. All right, since they were previously in your packet, I am going to request a motion for approval, please.
Motion to approve.
All right, can I get a second to that motion?
Second.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, now it is public comment period. This is an opportunity for the public to give any feedback, comments, or items that are of importance. I'm going to request from Jordan to see if there are any members of the public online first that may wish to comment. No?
That I can see.
All right. All right, and then are there any members of the public present that would like to comment? All right, I'll close the public comment period. I skipped around because I can't read this far, and I'm not in denial, really, of not needing glasses at this point. But all right, so I am going to turn it over to Ian for the review of the March 28th Policy Committee meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. We don't review it in every single detail. Just a quick overview for those who missed the meeting. The CTB meeting, we just discussed sending representatives to the spring CTB public meeting, which is going to be in our region. And we had 2 representatives from the policy committee agreed to go along, and I will also attend Smart Cal Round 5. We had an update. You're going to hear about that again this morning, so we won't belabor that. The CMAC and SDBG draft allocations, you all saw that as well, so we don't need to review that one again. And then I think for us an important item, the 2050 LRTP was finally adopted. And I think that we should just pause for 1 second just to say that personally, I know I was in the project, I guess, but I think it started before me under previous folks. It was worked on by just about everybody in this room at some point, made some contribution. So we just want to thank everybody that did make contributions, people that gave us edits, the staff, both those here in the room and those who are no longer with us that worked on LRTP. I think it's a great effort. We're ahead of the curve. I don't know of another single MPO in Virginia that has actually done their 2050 LRTP. So we're actually a bit ahead. Thank goodness. We can have a year's break and not talk about LRTPs for a year because we are a little bit ahead of the curve. Obviously, there'll be amendments as time goes on, and the CLRP will be adapted as time goes on. But it's just a moment to pause and say we've reached a milestone. It was approved. It is now our official long-range transportation plan with the CLRP. Next one. The TIP amendments were approved, so that is closed, and we don't have any current TIP amendments live. There are some coming, but we were asked to pause on those and not take them to public comment. So currently, all of the TIP amendments that we've received, apart from those that we were asked to pause on, have been approved, and they're now part of the TIP. And BPAC, new at-large member, was approved and appointed to BPAC, and we supported the letter for the Stafford Raise grant. The bylaw discussions, no new particular decisions were taken. We are expecting some advice from the Attorney General via one of our delegates to the state. And the Future Policy Committee schedule, they voted to keep it the same as it is now and not to change the schedule to be on the same evening as the GWRC board. Madam Chair, that's the agenda. Unless somebody has a question, it was just a quick overview. Most of those items you saw here in this meeting, so I don't belabor them again.
What's the raise grant? What is that, a federal grant application?
It's a federal grant program, and the deadline for this year's raise grants, I believe, is the 31st of May. So there is a notice from AMPO. I don't know if you subscribe to AMPO.
I'm not asking because I don't even think King Lord really qualify. I'm just curious what the program means for future purposes.
Yeah, I think they're up to, one of you who've done this before might be able to help me, but I think they're up to $25 million grants.
Okay.
Particularly, I think that the raise grants and build grants that were begun in the era of highways being seen as big infrastructure that splits up communities. And if we want to connect communities again, we need to have funding to do those sorts of things like build bridges and that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
These grants do that. And I think the grants are up to $25 million per item. And the deadline for submission is May. This particular one, though, is Stafford. I don't know if Stafford has any comment on their own one.
I'll let Brian comment. He's been taking the lead on the raise grant on our end.
Yeah, I think the deadline's the 14th of April, or at least that's what I'm stressed out about.
That's what I thought you said, but I got an email from AMPO saying that the deadline for raise grants is 31st of May. So I don't know. Maybe they're different categories of raise grants as well. Not all the same.
They recently released a series of different current federal funding opportunities. I did notice a couple of those were in May, so I mean, it's a lot to take in, but there's a particular emphasis on rural communities. So
Talking to me.
I'm sorry.
How you talking?
That's what we're working on towards too. So I definitely take a look.
All right.
And my understanding too, Ian, is it is the 14th, and they have up to $5 million for planning. You can apply for planning monies as well as construction money. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
All right, thank you. I'm not sure if I formally closed the public comment period, so again, if there are any members of the public that wish to speak, I think we're okay, so I'm formally closing the public comment period.
Great.
All right, the next item is number 7 under action and discussion items. We have one of our own, Nick, who is going to give us an update on BRE.
Yay.
Thank you.
Prepare.
Right.
And we will clap for you at the end regardless, Nick.
Clap for me at the end and hold all questions to the end.
It's always fun when somebody's asked us all the rude questions now to present weak.
Yeah. So, and Christine, as you might have mentioned, is on the line too. If you ask me a stumper at the end of this, then she might be able to answer it on behalf. So Go to the next slide. Basically, what I'm presenting to you this morning is a precursor to a larger effort that we're kicking off right now called the System Plan 2050, taking a holistic look at VRE's system, service, fleet, everything. We did kind of like a pre-work to try to answer these 5 questions. I think the ones that are the most important to this group here would be number 5, how have VRE's customers' mode of access to and from stations changed? And then also number 4, how are commute and non-commute trips different in the VRE service area, including the 95 corridor? Go to the next question. You guys might be very familiar with Streetlight. Obviously, one of your former own was very competent and proficient in that. But if you're not familiar, we use Streetlight basically as a basis for our analysis. Take a look at some of these trends. And it's very accurate with large sample counts, as we've discovered, but it's not so good with smaller sample counts. So I'll describe on the next slide, what we had to do. And basically, we brought in VRE's known catchment areas for the entire system. And this is just kind of like a snapshot of what you see in Streetlight to analyze the regional travel patterns. Next page. So yeah, this is basically the catchment areas from the 2018 TDP document that VRE has on file. These, we kind of did a little testing on these and found that they are still accurate, relatively speaking, even after COVID. So we use these as kind of the base. So for this group, I mean, really, in our region here, most of VRE's ridership is coming from, these major catchment areas. And you can see they do overlap. So just because you live in one area, like say in Spotsylvania, central Spotsylvania County, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to the Spotsylvania station. You might go to different stations. And there's reasons for that, and I can talk about that in a couple minutes. Next slide. But as I mentioned before, Streetlight's not really good at the smaller sample count. I mean, it needs a large sample count of cell phone location-based service data. So we had to supplement that with some VRE fare data, and we luckily had some good TVM and mobile fare data that we were able to kind of paint a more holistic picture of 2019 and 2020 rider patterns. And I'll just make a mention before we go to the next slide why we aren't showing 2021 right now. We do have that data, but what I'm trying to do here is really get y'all to understand at the low point, absolute lowest point of commuting, who was still on the train, who was still taking transit, and that is kind of forming, and hopefully in your region should form the baseline of if there's another major global disruption to commuting and travel patterns, who still needs to get places. And as I'll show you on the next slide, there were a number of people that did, so we can go on. Some of the results, high-level results from the analysis, this was animated, so I'm sorry that it's all, all the stuff on one slide. But what we found was that LaFont, prior to COVID, LaFont was our #1 destination station in the DC area. And in 2020, that reduced and was overtaken by Union Station. And I think the reason for that, we speculate, was that the federal workforce concentrated around LaFont had no reason to go in. So those who were still going in maybe had more of a nexus at Union Station. And we don't know exactly why, but we have some theories that I'm not going to speculate. But one of the big things I think for this region is that the Fredericksburg line ridership decrease at the very lowest point, like middle of 2020, was 15 percentage points less than on the Manassas line. So there was a much more resilient ridership coming from this region and going to destinations along the Fredericksburg line than on the Manassas side. The rider demographics really didn't change. We saw the same types of people riding as before. They were just doing it in much smaller numbers. This now, just in the last month, this isn't accurate. This is actually roughly 30%. We've seen a pretty good bump in our ridership since February. And like I said before, Fredericksburg line is more complicated in terms of the rider patterns. And this is important, I think, maybe for the Jamies of the world, that transit demand between the core catchment areas fell by 90%. But in like the Woodbridge and Manassas area, so kind of the outer local transit kind of markets, they only fell 33 and 50% respectively. So while you saw basically a collapse of the regional commuting transit, bus commuting market, the local markets, as I think we all know, remained fairly strong. I think I'm going to skip over, this one and really emphasize number 7. What we found is that from the VRE catchment areas to the core on the Fredericksburg and the Manassas line, the weekend travel demand in both directions is about the same in terms of volume as the AM peak direction on the weekdays. So just think about that. There's just as many, if not more, vehicles and vehicle trips in the midday on the weekends going north to the core, just to the core, as there are, between, say, 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. And it's really these non-commute trips that are driving the demand between this region and the core in that time. Maybe less important for this region, but we're really seeing a recovery that mirrors some of the other transit agencies that provide regional commuting services, like Sound Transit Sounder, which really runs a similar type of service in the morning, out in the afternoon, kind of unidirectional service with 1 or 2 real main kind of destinations. Let's go on to the next slide. So I'll stay on the slide for a little bit because it might be a little difficult for people to discern. But basically in 2019, these were the major travel patterns. Obviously, LaFont was bringing in 40% of the destination ridership. But you saw a lot of folks coming from Fredericksburg, Brook, and Quantico, and Lorton going into the core. Well, in 2020, those patterns dropped out, and what you really saw is those core riders, the people that were really on the service, we're doing kind of more interesting things. Like 8% of the overall ridership was just Spotsylvania or Quantico, right? So not even going into the core. Another 10% just Quantico to Union Station, and then another 12% Lorton to Union Station. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, what do these 2 stations have in common? Major military facilities. So we speculate that there was a decent amount of DoD kind of essential travel that was happening in that time. We were also speculating that the Spotsylvania to Quantico pattern was really due to the immense amount of congestion in the AM northbound and PM southbound, kind of between Rappahannock River and the kind of Quantico area. And so, that might have been enticing folks that knew about the service, that were familiar riding before COVID, to continue to ride, even for those short, like 20-minute trips. We can go on to the next slide. And as I kind of alluded to before, the dark blue is 2019 and the light blue is 2020. Rider demographics really didn't change much. I mean, this is showing when folks were riding. Most of our ridership out of this region leaves between 5 and 6 and 6 and 7. Or actually, really, it's between 4:30 and 6:30. So we're an early crowd, and so that's something that you might want to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about access planning stations in the future in terms of highways and just traffic planning. That most of our customers, our base customers, were accessing the Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg, Brook, and Leland stations between like 4:30 in the morning and 6:30 in the morning. Next slide. Racial demographics really have stayed the same. This kind of self-explanatory slide. And then on the next slide, the income has largely unchanged. And this was all courtesy of Streetlight's demographic feature. So on to the next slide. So this was kind of an illustration of the transit use changes. So this is in 2019. Really, Manassas line is not really pertinent for you all, but most of our transit origin destination trips were in the core, as to be expected. You have Metrobus, you have Dash, you have ART, and Metro Rail. But there was roughly 5% of the total transit trips were between Ripon and Woodbridge, kind of in that area. Interestingly enough, really the Fredericksburg, Leland, where you'd expect to see some of the Fred service, really didn't show up because it's just a fraction of the overall transit story in the core. But if you go to the next slide, what's interesting is just how greater of a share there is in that local. So that's basically OmniRide's local service. They're moving between the Ripon and Woodbridge catchment areas. And that exemplifies that while the regional transit really fell out, there was still a pretty hefty market there. What's interesting to note is that, because I was trying to figure out why didn't the commuter bus kind of patterns show up in this. You know, you might see some Leland and Brook into the core. They're a fraction of the overall transit usage. I mean, just the amount of people going between Crystal City and Union Station on Metro versus bus, I mean, they don't even show up in the overall pattern.
How is this data collected?
This is streetlight. So this is basically taking the streetlight catchment areas and doing their transit analysis and saying who's going from catchment area A to catchment area B. And it's location-based services trips for a defined period. Go to the next slide. And this is kind of exemplifying what I said earlier about the auto travel patterns. Now, this is, I know the VRE logos above these bars, but this is just auto trips because I wanted to get a sense for how much volume we've got on 95 through the Fredericksburg region. In 2019, you know, the highest period of volume was that AM northbound, you know, period, which made sense to everyone. That's where, you know, hot lanes are open in those directions. You know, all of the regional commute services really work to serve that market. In 2020, you know, that dropped to less than a quarter. And in 2021, it started up to between 30,000 and 40,000 daily trips. But if you look in 2021, and I think the last period of measurement was September, October 2021, you can see that the volume in the AM northbound is the same as the weekend northbound between midday and PM. Yes.
Sorry, we just can't see the fine print from this back end of the room.
Sure.
Just remind us what the colors are, what each of the color bars are.
So the colors are the time periods. So this is early AM till 5 AM. This is from 5 to 10, 10 to 3, 3 to 8, and 8 to 12.
And those are cars?
And these are auto trips, yeah.
So why is there a VRE logo on the dark blue one?
Excellent question. Those are the markets that VRE serves.
Ah, okay.
So this is to illustrate
got it now.
that there's a missing piece of the pie, as you've alluded to in several of these meetings, that VRE does not currently serve. And, you know, there's analysis that will get underway as part of the system plan to look at how we might be able to better serve those markets. Because when you look at the volumes, again, this is fall of 2021, so it's the most recent data we had. You know, we'll continue to analyze this into the future. But, I mean, really, you're looking at over 30,000 trips in both of those periods. So more than 60,000 trips occurring on the weekend between 10 a.m. and 8 p.m. going north to the field. And then next slide. And then this is just showing the reverse. So colors stay the same, but looking at the peak PM period, these are the markets where VRE serves today. And it's really the same story. There's a decent amount of weekend travel heading outbound in the peak PM, as well as, you know, weekday travel heading outbound in the peak PM too. So we'll go on to the next slide. And this was kind of the last piece of the puzzle. While we weren't able to really break it down by mode, as I mentioned before, the streetlight data doesn't do as good a job when the total counts are low. We generally assume that because most of our customers access the stations by single occupant vehicle or they get dropped off, I think it's like close to 90% at some stations. We figured just analyzing the auto trips would give us a overall picture of you know, who's accessing our stations and at what time. And so you can see, obviously, Leland has a significant amount of entries to the station. Now, these are vehicle entries or vehicle trips into the station. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Actually, I misspoke. This is actually all vehicles, so any device. So if you did walk into the station, you would be counted in this count. But for Leland, there are very, very few, you know, walk-in trips. But you can see just the overall volumes of entries. And you can see that it really is peaked in the 4 to 6 to 7 a.m. window, and it drops off. Obviously, our last train goes north at about this time. So not sure what people are doing here. Maybe they're catching, you know, van pools or commuting to other places. But on to the next slide. So we ran an analysis too to just understand where the concentrations of the home locations, so this is where that cell phone spends its evening and night, that is entering each of the stations. And so while this isn't complete because there's a data privacy thing, so some of these don't, some people don't show up if it's just one person here, one person there, but, if there's more than one or two, Streetlight will pick it up. And so really the greatest clusters are kind of along Spotsylvania Parkway, kind of out west of Spotsylvania Station. There is a decent amount of travel coming out off of 208 and there's this Route 1 coming down there, and even into Caroline County. But the bulk of our Spotsylvania riders, recently, or I guess in 2019, were coming from these areas here. Fredericksburg, kind of a similar story. It was more spread out, and that was interesting to us, is that we thought, Fredericksburg ridership would be more concentrated in the city, but that's really not the case. And unless they're, Streetlight is skimming, doing things that we don't know, I mean, really it's kind of similar areas. And so I think what we saw with people choosing, well, if I get up maybe 5 minutes later, leave my house 15 minutes later, I can get to the train station 15 minutes later because the train takes about 10 to 15 minutes to get between stations. So you would think that these folks might be going to Spotsylvania, but they might be choosing Fredericksburg instead for that reason. And then going on up the line, Leland really had the bulk of the traffic in 2019, and it's kind of the same story. I mean, even folks kind of in central Spotsylvania and southern Stafford County were using Leland, and I think, when you look on Google Maps, just throw a random, put a point here, put a point there. Travel time to Leland, travel time to Spotsylvania, it's almost the same. And so I think a lot of customers were choosing to access Leland just because they could get up a few minutes later. And that was putting a pretty big strain on the parking lot, because prior to COVID in 2019, that parking lot was jam full between the carpools and the van pools and our customers. Meanwhile, Spotsylvania was, maybe at about 50% capacity. So, and then finally, Brook, as you would expect, most folks are coming kind of off of that. What is that? 6:30, 6:10, 6:30, one of those 6:10.
6:10, I think.
Coming down and accessing Brook from some of the major corridors, the east-west corridors. So, to the extent that this has implications for the east-west study, and how we're looking at, we'll continue to look at where people are coming from, because we really wanted to start with the baseline. So this was 2019. Once we get a better sense for how ridership is recovered, we'll probably run this analysis again for 2021, 2022, and to see if these maps look any different, just based on the demographic data being similar and the fact that our service really hasn't changed in the last couple of years. I don't see these patterns changing all too greatly. So, last couple slides here. Just wanted to point out that really ridership is a factor of the service that is operated. And so, as I alluded to before, some of our peer systems across the country, like Sounder, which is represented in gray, really have very similar recovery patterns to VRE. Obviously, everyone hit the bottom in April of 2020 and has slowly been coming up. What you don't see is obviously 2022, which data we don't have yet, but it would kind of look like this. So you're seeing a pretty healthy rebound as people start to return, and especially the federal workforce, which is like 10% of our ridership starts to return to the offices. And this just also shows that, we're normalizing for vehicle revenue hours too. VRE still, our recovery trend still mirrors that of Sounder. In case you're wondering, this yellow line, that's Tri-Rail down in South Florida, Miami area, and the reason why they've had such a healthy recovery is because they operate through multiple employment centers, activity centers. It's more of a tourism-based system, and they run in both directions all day. So, and on weekends. And so, going into the system plan, as I alluded to, we're going to be looking at exploring different service scenarios based on some demand analyses that we're going to perform, and looking at, a broad range of service scenarios, and then narrowing it down to like maybe 3 or 4 realistic service scenarios. And so we will probably 1 or 2 times throughout the next 12 months be coming back to this group and others to solicit feedback on some of the draft strategies. I know that things like weekend service, reverse peak service is a hot topic around here, so we'll be talking about those. We'll also be looking to identify some complementary transit partnerships. And this is really important because as we look to serve different markets at different times of day, I mean, it's very expensive to put new trains on the line, but it's relatively inexpensive to provide complimentary bus service as kind of a, as a trial or something like that, to provide our customers with some flexibility if they need to come home or go to work or do things at different times of what our service runs. So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be continuing to work with VPRA and agreements that are set out for us in the Transforming Rail in Virginia agreements, and really also using that system plan effort to explore some fare policy enhancements that might help us attract some of those new markets to the system. So that was a very quick rundown of what we've done so far and what we plan to do in the next 12 to 18 months as we develop our system plan. So I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions.
Does anybody have any questions for Nick? All right.
Yes.
In terms of federal government return to work, was there something in terms of policy that caused this jump that we've seen in 2022?
Yeah, I think that in April, early April, or I guess in the middle of March, more federal agencies started to formally announce their return to work policies and what it actually meant. Like, okay, you're going to be going this many days a week, you're going to be going that many days a week. And once those plans were solid and we weren't just seeing the occasional riders that maybe had to come in for a meeting or to fix their computer or whatever, I think that's when you started to see the habitual ridership start to rebound.
Is there anything like a general kind of statement, in terms of how many days or which days or anything that you've been able to?
That I'm aware of, no. I think what I've heard through the grapevine is that agencies are being left to implement policies on an agency-wide basis based on what's best for their SOP and, their mission and vision and all that stuff. So, but what I can say is that, the trains are more full now than they were 4 months ago, so.
Yeah. This is Christine.
Oh, sorry, Christine.
Just to chime in, and, Nick is correct. I mean, we don't have a sense of agency by agency what their schedules are, but we are noticing, which is consistent with pre-pandemic conditions, that, that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, those are the busiest days for ridership. More people are riding then than Mondays and Fridays. And as ridership is recovering, that trend is continuing.
Any other questions?
Yeah, quick question. Can you go back to the slide with the bus arriving to the station? And I know you said it was streetlight data. I was curious because in my train streetlight data, you can just pick up the cell phone. How did you distinguish what was a transit use change and what was just something coming from a car? How were we able to use streetlight to determine that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And just to clarify, I might not have done as good of a job on this slide. This is transit activity between catchment areas. So we're looking at, like, if somebody could choose to take a train between Ripon and Woodbridge catchment area to access, an activity center or whatever, they could also take a bus. And we know that the two aren't, comparable today, but we just wanted to get a sense for how much activity. So it's not necessarily that 7.5% of the total activity is going from the Woodbridge station to the Ripon station per se. It's just that they're operating in that kind of VRE defined.
So these are just showing the a trend change in trip, origin, and destination throughout all uses from whatever your geolocated point is at these stations. So it doesn't have anything to actually do with transit. It's just people that are more likely now going from Woodbridge to Ripon than they were
Well,
a year ago.
It does in that we actually segmented, these are just transit users. So they've got, Streetlight's got some algorithm that guesses with some degree of accuracy that the way you're operating on the road network, suggests that you're in a transit vehicle.
Really?
I don't know how they do that.
Yeah.
They won't tell us that, but, maybe it's like proximity to other cell phone, you're all kind of going to a cluster, making lots of stops. They can do something and say, all right, well, this person is not in a SOV.
Cool, I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah. So, but really the big story here is that while the core transit use, Metrobus, on DAS, on ART, on Metro Rail really dropped pretty considerably. we were still seeing a lot of the local traffic, and just the only reason, or the local transit use, and just the only reason why Fredericksburg, Leland, Brook, places where Fred operates doesn't show up is it is just a very small fraction, and VRE doesn't do, or Streetlight doesn't do a very good job of capturing, if there's 10 trips, they might knock all those out for privacy reasons or other reasons, so.
And some of that was we weren't running.
And that's another thing too, yeah.
Streetlight's great, but the more detail you want, the fewer people will be operating that meet those exact criteria. And when you get below a certain threshold, it's not accurate anymore. So Streetlight is great for the aggregate, for the big movements.
Yeah.
But if you want to try and get the people that turn left every second Tuesday, it's not going to be accurate. So you've got to keep it a level or two above that level of analysis. You've got to go, in a month, how many people are moving between these 2 points?
Yeah.
It's fairly accurate.
Yeah.
You just mustn't try to get down to very specific, localized, time-bound. The more criteria you put on, the less the accuracy is still there.
Yeah, and that's why those bar chart slides that I presented on total auto demand between the catchment areas is important, because it's capturing a lot of data points over a long period of time, but it's also saying these are folks that are going between VRE's known catchment areas and the core. So these are transit, like trips that could be served by transit, by rail transit in the future, but aren't today. So.
Thanks.
I got one more quick one.
Yeah.
Regarding weekend service, you're saying that there's a decision-making process. Do you have a schedule for that?
No schedule yet.
I've been trying to get that out of it.
Yeah. And right now, just so you're aware, what the Transforming Rail in Virginia agreement allows us to do, I say allows us, it's not prescribing, but it allows us to start running weekend service as soon as 2026. But that's all contingent on some very specific infrastructure that has to be built in the Northern Virginia area, that is, subject to construction schedules, procurement schedules, all that.
And I'll chime
Any
in,
other
that's also subject to the VRE Operations Board adopting the budget that includes funding for operating funding for that weekend service.
Any other questions for Nick?
All right, thank you.
All right, we will move over to Jordan. I think you've got a few items for the group. CMAC, SDBG, and 3 items underneath.
Jordan has got a tough job with this thing, so if any of you are mean to her, you're going to have to deal with me.
So first, I want to start by reviewing the progress to date, the first 2 slides. So like we mentioned last time, we received 3 active transportation applications based on the modified call for projects that we all approved. We held screening calls and scored and ranked 3 applications. We also discussed the use of SDBG funds with each of the applicants based on need. And then we created a draft set of allocations that we presented to you guys last month. So the next slide. And then after the TAC meeting, VDOT came back with lots of questions related to project estimates and the allocations that were made on each one, and that they would be overfunded. So we held a meeting with each of the localities to say, hey, we need to either have updated cost estimates so that it doesn't look like we're overfunding these projects, and make sure that there's clear decision on how we're going to list this funding. We also received information with the new SIP draft budget that there's going to be additional funding in each fiscal year and also in the previous years. So I'll move into the draft budget now on the next slide. So this is just a snapshot of how it is without being modified. And then on the next slide, I modified it to make it a little easier to read to see what the changes are. So these talks above the subtotal line is what the draft budget is. And then below that is what we assumed was the budget based on the last cycle, and then the changes in the dollars. So red and green doesn't mean positive or negative. It just means when we need to allocate that money. So green means we must allocate. So we need to allocate the previous and FY23 dollars because they are critical and need to be spent now. The red means that we can allocate them, but we don't have to. We can save that in the reserve in the regional project or the balance entry. And then the blue, based on the FY23 28 modified call for projects. We said we're not touching FY 28 dollars until next round in the fall in September. So our suggestion was to hold that money.
So don't move off the slide. Just everybody stop and stare at the slide for 1 second. Jordan said that very quickly, and I wanted to sink in. The green and the red money is the new money that we did not know about when we presented these recommendations to you last month. Okay, do you all get that? This is additional money that we did not know about and we did not allocate. We only got advised of it since you last saw the allocation. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Yeah, so the combination total for CMAQ is 1.56 million, and the combination total for SCDG is 1.59 million without the FY22 dollars. If you want to, if you allocate all of that money.
Thanks.
Do you have any questions specifically on this, how it's laid out, before I move on to the proposal to use the funds? Okay, so the next slide. So this is just for the CMAQ dollars. So our proposal is to fully fund the request that we received for the FY23 through 28 modified call for projects. So last month we told you we were only partially funding based on the amount of funds we had for each of the projects we received. And you can see that in the initial draft. That's what we were able to allocate. Now that we have more money, we're able to fill the remaining need of those projects. So on your request amount, we'll be able to fund the full request that was received for each of the projects. And then, based on the excess, depending on which fiscal year the money is in and how much money is left, there's 2 other projects on the list outside of the modified call for projects that need a CMAQ allocation to be fully funded. So that would be the Spotsylvania New Transit and then also the Fred 3 bus purchase replacement. So those are the other 2 needs that are on the list that would be available to use CMAQ money. Did anybody have a question about the proposal for the CMAQ funds? Again, this is
Jordan, this is Paul. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I had a couple questions. The first question is, do we know why the money went up?
Do we know why the money went up? Was that your question?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that was just because we received the draft budget from VDOT. I don't know if VDOT has any specific reason as to why the budget went up.
We got more money. They got more money to be redistributed. That's what it comes down to.
That's all we know, Paul.
Okay.
All right, Paul, your second question?
The second question is there enough CMAQ funding available with the additional funds to fund all of these projects?
I don't believe there will be enough to fund the both of the 2 excess projects outside of the FY23-28 modified call for projects, but there's enough for the 3 projects that were applied this round. So we can, after we fill the need of these, we can stop and save that money for the regional balance or the balance entry, and not allocate to these 2 projects, but there is some money that will be able to go to these projects. It will not fully fund both of the ones on the bottom. We can fully fund all the ones in the modified call for projects that we received.
Do we know how short we are?
So for CMAQ, there's a total of $1.561 million, and we can, obviously just looking at the last 3 bus purchase replacement, that one is 1.4, so that one will be the least funding on it. So I can do calculations real quick, but I don't have off the top of my head.
It's roughly 500,000 will be available for those last 2, and the one is 330 and the other one is 1.4. So it's 1.7 something minus about 500. So there will still be a need of, 1.2-ish. Those are just off the top of my head in the meeting. Those are not accurate numbers.
So I know that with the capital projects for transit, that 5307 can be used to fund those. So I'm wondering, could we send a letter to GWC requesting that 5307 be used to fully fund the 3 bus purchase replacement project?
I think that would be based on the TAC in general and then the applicant of Fred because they're the ones that would need the money as their project.
It also depends on how much money is available of 5307 and in which year.
Yeah.
But I have no objection to that in principle, but that's...
I don't think Fred has any issue with doing that. I think ultimately, as we've talked about before, is that anything that's not funded, is an ask for the localities, which we've talked to GWRC about funding projects before, so we're still working on movement on that. So as soon as we get some movement, I think we'll be okay. But I don't have any issue with that. Does anybody else have any issue with, I don't know if we're at the recommendation phase. Are we at that, Jordan?
I guess the question would be like, hey, what would you need from us, like a specific letter, or would that need to be an application submitted in the next call for project for 5307? How would that process look?
Yeah, so we're hoping to do another kind of call for project, and we haven't set a process for that. I think the first part of the conversation would be how much money would be needed for what and when.
So I think we're at $500,000 would be the balance. So I think for Fred, we don't have any issue moving forward if it's okay with the committee, pushing forward all the projects, fully funding Spotsylvania's project, because I don't think piecemealing projects is ever a good idea if we don't have to, and then fund what's available or what can be made for the bus replacement. Maybe we just replace one bus, maybe we replace 2 buses, and we deal with that when we get there. But I don't think it should be contingent on GWRC funding, because we're still going to move forward regardless.
So for us as staff, if we can just clarify, what's being suggested is that we fund the 3 new projects. We then fund the Spotsylvania commuter parking space, and then the balance, which is about, I'm guessing, $200,000, is probably what's left over. And we're saying put that on the 3 buses, and then for the rest, Fred would go to GWRC for 5307 funding to try and make up additional funding. Is that what we're saying? I just want to clarify so that I understand.
So at this point, what I would say is yes, except that Fred would, I don't think it needs to be part of this discussion, but Fred will seek other funding sources for the remaining balance. So we can separate the two of, we're just proceeding with TAC recommendation, which is literally what Ian just said, and we will seek other funding sources. So it may not be GWRC, it may be a capital grant asked from the state, it could be 50,000 other things. So that way it's not tied to this discussion.
That makes sense.
Paul, did you hear all of that? I just wasn't sure whether you were connected. Okay, well, we need to.
All right.
And so with that proposal, we can then move on to the STDG funding on the next slide. So we were able to fund, and this is sort of still in the works, and I guess put a little note at the bottom based on what the cost estimates are, because we're still getting the approved cost estimates from the localities to submit to VDOT, making sure everyone is fully funded based on the cost estimates they have. Right now, there's 2 projects on the list that would show a need, exit 126, Route 1 southbound improvements, and then the Garrisonville Road widening project. And then I can turn it over to Ian to talk a little bit more about the second bullet point here, a request from Kinko.
Okay, so you will probably have forgotten now, but over the last 2 years, for the LRTP effort, STBG funds were allocated. And over the last 2 years, $109,000 of those funds allocated to the long-range transportation plan project were removed by this body and the policy committee and allocated to roadway projects. During the time, I think, partly when Tampa didn't have an administrator and partly when the LRTP effort was not being focused on as much, because remember, this is a 4-year LRTP. Some of that money, $56,000, went to fund the Telegraph Road project, some other roadway projects. So $109,000 was removed. Now we've come to the end of the project, we've finished the LRTB, and to close it out, we are short about $30,583, largely to pay the large consultant invoice and some staffing costs. So we're requesting that out of this additional funding that we've gotten now from the state for SDBG, that we are allocated that amount to close out the LRTP. The second one of those line items is a request from us, and I put a letter in to say that we want to run this freight summit in FY23. So we're starting to work it into our new UPWP, and that $30,000 would go to fund the freight summit and write a glossy report from the freight summit, which we can then use to argue with OIFI about changing VTRANS needs. And as you know, once you've changed VTRANS needs, you can then get the points you need to get your roadway and rail projects funded, because now your freight problem is now a VTRANS need. There are a number of freight issues in our region that are not VTRANS needs. We've spoken to OIFI about this. So we're planning to run a freight summit with freight operators and economic development people. It's the other extreme of the hats that I wear, right? So I've been talking to you about bikes and about transit and about bike paths and about bridges and tunnels. Now I'm talking to you about trucks and moving freight. And we want to run a freight summit, which is not like a big study, you know, a big $200,000 study. This is a smaller effort. It's a freight summit in which we will try to engage with freight operators, economic development people from your jurisdictions, plus possibly a consultant. We haven't decided whether or not to use a consultant or whether to try and do it in-house, etc. To have a freight summit to produce a report on what the freight problems are in our region. We know one of them, it's a delay time. We have the worst freight delay time in the state between here and Washington, D.C. So right through our region and up the I-95 corridor is a big freight delay problem. So the point of that summit is to try to understand that problem, to engage with freight operators in our region, and to come with a report which illustrates the problem. And we're asking for $30,000 to fund that freight summit, which is the letter that I put in. So those are two additional requests. And as you know, in our new policy, that's the method we're supposed to use to request funds as FAMPO staff. We can't evaluate our own requests, so we put it in the form of a letter, we send it to the TAC deliberates, the policy committee deliberates and decides whether that is a reasonable request and whether it should be granted. So that's my explanation for those two items. Happy to take any questions.
Quick question, just to confirm, freight, you're talking about both rail and truck?
Yes,
okay.
Any freight that moves into or out of our region, and in some cases moves through our region.
Okay.
So both freight, rail, CSX essentially, and largely road freight, which is, and also it's 5 jurisdictions that we're looking at here. I've not put this in this particular slide because this is not a GWRC meeting, this is a FAMPO meeting, but we've also spoke in our rural work program to the 2 rural jurisdictions, Caroline and King George. We've had meetings with them. They would like to also participate in the Freight Summit, and so it will be a joint effort that we'd like to see in the future. But we're trying to keep the budget fairly small so that this doesn't become a big, massive project.
This is me thinking, but is $30,000 for the entire project?
So we might use a little bit of the rural work program in addition to the study. So maybe 40.
If you're going to include the other locations, you're going to need to include some other
rural work program funding.
So it doesn't get you into some technical with it.
Correct. So if you look at the UPWP, which is also in the pack today, you'll see I'm talking about 40 in the UPWP, but I'm only talking about 30 coming from FAMPO because I'm looking at 10 from the rural program, or maybe a few dollars in PL funds to make it up to 40, whatever the case is.
That's what I'm wondering.
Okay.
And And this is a totally new project, you're not gonna include it in,
It's not in this year, it's in FY '23, so it's in our new UPWP, and it's a totally new project.
but for your.
But we want to
spreadsheet, you
put
wanna
it in the
new project.
spreadsheet now as a new project, which is why we're raising it.
That's established.
We have to get approval first. We're not assuming it's stop that you're all just going to give us the money. We're requesting it.
This trucking, is it including local companies here, they're
Yes.
doing hauling, things like that?
Yes, large volumes of freight. We'll talk to anybody, and the FRA, the Fredericksburg Regional Alliance, have agreed to assist us with getting lists of the trucking companies that are working in our region. We're going to approach them formally, request them to send a person. So literally, we want to talk to people who move freight to tell us the problem. We've got the data, the metrics, right? OIP and Vitrons and so on give us the metrics, and Jordan has spent a lot of her time getting those data, where the delays are, how much volume of freight is being moved. We've got all the data, but what we don't have is the lived experience of the truck drivers and of the freight companies who are having delays. What do they experience? So we're going to take the data work, which we're doing, and put it together with the experience of what we get from the freight companies and the economic development people from your jurisdictions to tell us what are the real problems you're seeing, put that together in a report with the data, and we're asking the FRA and we're asking OIP. In fact, I'm going to try and get Jatender to be a guest speaker at this event and participate himself, so that OIP is actually directly involved in the freight summit. But we just want to do a one-day summit. It's not a 12-month study that we're looking for.
Does anybody have any questions? Brennan?
Hey, so I just wanted to mention briefly, that's a great idea. I do recall you having mentioned that like several months ago, that aspiration. And just to share and disclose, and I know we haven't had much opportunity to talk about, FAMPA was very supportive in getting us coordinated with our endorsement letter from the entire policy committee for our RAISE application. One of the proposed projects kind of dovetails off of that idea, which would be to, in partnership and collaboration, somewhat of the underlying merits of the RAISE application, to support that sort of initiative. So we're going to include a suggestion about Stafford County specific freight movement activity with the goal of coordinating with the MPO to identify where there's some potential recommendations for the locality for enhanced efficiency. So that's not an endorsement of the proposal before us right now, but it is contextually supportive, if you will. And if we were awarded those resources, we would certainly want to contribute to making perhaps the summit, the impetus to a perhaps more greater analysis utilizing the resources of the MPO and funds that we might benefit from.
Okay. Thank you.
Any comments, questions?
Sorry, my time just.
Please.
Keep running my mouth. So I have no problem with the ones you've chosen here. I just want to ask the question of why were these chosen over top of the other projects that we have funding and are going to go to bid before these two that need funding?
So these two, the LRTP, are you talking about?
I'm talking about exit 120, the Route 1, 126, and the Garrisonville.
So Jordan.
Because they're so far out, but I'm looking here and I noticed Unville is short about $4 million, and then Courthouse Road 208 is short about $1 million.
Those weren't requests that we received. I know on Bill Stafford, so if you have any questions.
Okay, that's what I needed.
Yeah, I'll have to double check. I think we're okay for on.
Some of those are getting local funding, so we don't need to put FAMPA funding in.
Just want to make sure that we don't program before we.
Otherwise, they'll get double counted again. So we're not funding ones where the locality told us no, they don't need it right now.
And then the other one you mentioned,
They're going to fund it.
the other one you mentioned was 208, right?
Yeah, it's Courthouse Road, Courthouse Road 208, Hood Drive. It's short about land.
Do you know anything about that one?
That one I do not. I will need to look into it.
Okay, yeah. Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And then the last slide is just sort of the next step. So we're gonna, with your guys' consent, kind of program these proposals into the spreadsheet so that we can have a final proposal in the May meeting at TAC, so that you guys can endorse that and then we can bring that to the policy committee. So that the allocation of all this new money that we just found out about with the draft SIP and then some of the additional requests that we have made. And then we're gonna pass it off to VDOT and they will get it to the CTB for approval. And then in September, we're gonna give them a new call for projects. That'll be allocating FY '24 through '29 funding and start that call for projects in the fall. Also in the agenda packet is the request letter that Ian wrote and signed, and then the VDOT comments that we received on the spreadsheet. So those are both also attached to the agenda for your discussion.
And before we leave this item, Jordan and I just want to make you aware of or remind you of the need for you to close out the discussion between the localities and VDOT as to adjusting the cost estimates on your projects, because we have to allocate the funding, and it's not a sorted out when you get to it kind of thing. It's a we need it by Friday kind of thing, because we have to spend a lot of time tweaking that spreadsheet to make sure that it's correct. And I know you don't know how complicated that spreadsheet is. Paul might, because he had to do this before, but it is a pain because you can't just allocate funding. You've got to find the correct year that you've got the funding available, and it's normally not the year that you need the funding, and then you do these fancy movements of money that only God understands to get it from one column into another column. We know how to do it, but trust me, it is really hard. So you can't do it quickly. You can't just go take a pen and fix it. Jordan and I have to sit for hours trawling through this to make sure we've got the right funding of the right type in the right year to allocate to the right project. It's complicated, and if you move one, you move five, because it's got a knock-on effect. So all of that to tell you, we need you to get your cost estimates finalized by the end of the week, because we need to know how much to give you, and we won't know that if we don't know what your cost estimate is. So all those ones in yellow are the ones that Susan said she thinks in their system have a lower cost estimate than what the locality thinks. Now, we've had meetings with all of you. We've gone through all of them line by line. You know what they are. There's nothing new. There's no new information today. We're just asking you to finish the process of sending your documents to VDOT and getting those cost estimates concluded by Friday, because then Jordan and I need to sit and do all that fancy fiddling to make that spreadsheet work before you need to approve it next month.
And then I'll send a reminder email today just based on the UPCs and what we discussed about the last time, the follow-up email I sent, so I can just send that out just as a reminder too.
If you would like to send it out as a calendar invite so the rest of us don't forget to actually respond to your emails, because it's lost in the 500 other emails that we probably received, that may be helpful with a 15-minute reminder that it's due.
Yeah.
I'm not speaking for me, I'm just.
Very, very good idea. I'm sure we'll send a calendar invite.
I'm sending it to VDOT Friday afternoon. We'll not get it reviewed and get updated in our system by Friday. So just, you need some time to look at it, review it. We are estimating policies that are updated this year. It's supposed to be reviewed by some people, so.
Don't send it on Friday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
Send it as soon as you've got the information this week, so that VDOT has got a chance to process it, please. Otherwise, what's going to happen, the alternative is that what's going to happen is VDOT's going to insist that their cost estimate is correct, and then we're going to have to allocate you less money. That's what the end result is if you don't get it. Sorry to be the meanie, but I've got to finish the process so that you can vote on it next month. Otherwise, we don't have an approved list.
Okay. All right, so just to clarify, so we're not really voting on anything right now. At this point, we're just providing consensus on the CMAQ projects that you've allocated, Harrison Road, Stafford Barrow, and Bankside Trail. If the jurisdictions have any modifications based on Susan's comments, please let Fampo staff know ASAP, so the letter that they revised will be for the same amount of money, but just for a different project that you wanted allocated to. So if y'all could get that to Jordan before the end of the week, too.
Yep.
Those projects that are on the slides that Jordan just showed, I kind of just want you to say, yes, we can proceed on that basis, because remember, we've got to turn that into allocations, we've got to put it in the spreadsheet. So if you don't like those projects that we just discussed and the method we just discussed for allocating the money, tell us now, we won't be offended, tell us that you don't agree with those, and then we will need to just come up with alternatives.
So Alex and Rodney, do y'all have any comments on the Harrison Road Stafford Borough project? Are y'all good with those?
I'm good with that.
Okay, so we're good to go. Lakeside Trail, okay.
Hey, Madam Chair, I actually had a couple of questions.
Okay, go ahead.
So the one thing I wanted to say, basically, with the additional funding requests, we support.
Paul, you've broken up. Sorry, could you say again?
Or text Rodney furiously.
Yeah.
All right, we'll come back to that if Paul's comments, unless anything changes, we'll proceed, but we'll come back to Paul's comments once we can hear you again, Paul. We can't hear you. I don't want you to think we're ignoring you. So yes, proceed with, does anybody have any issues with the additional funding request for the financial closeout for LRTP or the Freight Summit? I'm seeing no comments, so I'm taking that as consensus that staff can move forward with funding those. And just Freight Summit, I think, honestly, is an economic development issue that we probably won't see until we get out of the study, so I do think it's actually worthwhile cause. We did it in Hampton Roads, and to see the challenges and the cost of freight delay, it was actually ridiculous. So kudos to this group. Okay, Paul, we'll wait till you come back. Just shout, please. All right, next item.
Cal.
Good morning. So, as you all know, Friday was the big deadline to get pre-applications in, so we got them all in. Slide. And now we are in screening. VDOT is working with our pre-applications and hopefully letting us know if anything needs to change. I'll keep you all posted on that process. Next slide. We still have 5 on each list. You are familiar with all of these at this point. And next month, or the month after at the very latest, one has to come off of each side. Next slide. So you know all of these already. US 1 Slay Hill Road. Next slide. US 1 Route 628. This was a pipeline project that was narrowed down to improvements at this intersection. Next slide. Warrenton Road, new sidewalk on the south side. Next slide. Dixon Street, that changed a little bit. This is a new sketch that you haven't seen that was given to us Thursday or Friday by VDOT. But basically, we're going to have our, there it is. We're going to have our shared use path right here going down Beulah Salisbury to connect with existing pathways in the Dixon Park. And a sidewalk along the Dixon Street frontage. Next slide. At Lafayette Boulevard, several sections of sidewalk and a new bus stop at Wellington Woods. Next slide. And VCR Regional Project, part of the Bankside Trail and connections up Lafayette. And then connection to the terminus out near I-95. Next slide. This one is a 8-lane widening and a new commuter bus service from Route 1 Commonwealth Drive parking lot. That's going to be 3 buses going to Nova. Next slide. So Route 3 is a pipeline project. At this point, we have not decided exactly what the scope's going to be for this. I submitted the entire study area, knowing that it's going to have to be, we're going to have to get together and have a meeting and decide what we submit. Next slide. US 1 corridor improvements. Now this one ended up being a shared use path on the west side from Harrison Road, the existing piece of shared use path on Harrison Road, all the way up to Kingsmill Drive. the scope may have to be, and probably will have to be narrowed, but we want to start there. It would be a great piece of infrastructure for the region. Next slide. Mass Connect Corridor, again, it's shared use path going down Route 1 and a, what are those things called? Roundabout at Guinea Station Road. Next slide. And that's it. That's the whirlwind tour of all of our pre-applications that are currently in the system. We're going to, like I said, receive feedback. We have to remove one project from each list, and then August 1st is our drop dead date for the final applications. Now, we here at FAMPA would like to submit our final applications on July 28th. So we're hoping to get our ducks in a row. Any questions?
Any questions from the group, the committee?
Just from our side, there are one or two projects where the initial cost estimates that we've been getting from VDOT, et cetera, are pushing over the $20 million mark. And we are raising our eyebrows at those costs. And so we probably need to have a conversation with our jurisdictions about, does absolutely every part of this have to be on the project, because we may just not get funded because it's such an expensive project. So for example, the BCR Trail project, I'm not sure why it's so pricey. It might be the land acquisition part of it might be expensive. It might be the Bankside Trail part of it might be expensive. I don't know yet. But I think we need to dig into those numbers and see why it's so pricey. We might need to reduce the scope if that's still feasible, so that it doesn't just get rejected because it's just too expensive. So there are a couple of those where we just need to have a look at what's been submitted and see whether it's going to be viable. We then have to clarify that one pipeline study where we really don't have a clear decision from the jurisdictions about the Route 3 corridor as to which, Carrie mentioned this, which particular aspect we should be submitting. And then finally, as she also pointed out, we've got to drop one from each list. So that's also a conversation we need to have. So those are the conversations we need to have in the next month. So, and any guidance, feel free to give us VDOT if we need to be aware of something. And finally, just from my side, let me just say this, sorry, Michelle. I really just want to thank VDOT. You've heard me get gruff with VDOT sometimes and say, hey, I don't agree, and I don't apologize for trying to fight for our little corner here at FAMPA, but I do want to thank VDOT. These folks and their colleagues back at the office, engineers and so on, have worked long hours in the last 2 weeks to really help us, and it got real crazy in the last 2 weeks. So I just think we should publicly thank VDOT for all those extra hours and for giving us, I think, more support than some districts get from their VDOT office.
Most districts.
So I think that we should just thank VDOT, and I'd like to do that. We'll still fight for our corner, but we do really appreciate you go beyond the call of duty for us, and thank you very much.
Well, we appreciate that, Ian, very much. The team has worked very hard. They will continue to. As soon as you know if you have any changes, we appreciate you passing those along just as quickly as you may know them. As you can imagine, there's not an easy button that we can press just to, take one thing out or put one thing in. So it's a little bit frustrating sometimes to the fleet of engineers that we have working on all of these to make changes. So it is their goal to make your applications for any of the localities or the MPO, PDCs, as competitive for our area as possible. So that is their end goal on making them as accurate as possible with the sketches and the costs. And that's important for all the applicants when they're getting ready to enter that information on their own, to make sure the words match your sketch and match what we've estimated, because as we come to find out when they hopefully get funded for us, that's what they hold us to designing and then building. And if all those things line up, we don't have any issues. If all those things don't line up, then we run into some, we have to smooth some things over, and that's a little difficult sometimes. Thank you very much.
All right, Jordan, did you have an item?
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back. We got a comment from Paul with the CMAQ STBG. He said that we support the additional funding. The question is what type of funding would be used. My thoughts would be HIP rather than STBG. I think on Santos' perspective, we don't care either way which funding is used to do the freight summit. But I don't know if anybody had any comments related back to that about the usage of HIP or SCBG.
And it doesn't, I've always said, y'all need to treat it just like SCBG. It's the same. It's just that it has the ruling of you gotta give it within a certain amount of time frame. So there's no difference on that.
All right, does any members of the committee have a comment on that? My preference would be HIP just because we can do more with SCBG, but does anybody else have any other comments?
We're happy to do that. We'll do that. Thanks.
And Jamie, before I have one other comment.
Please.
Susan, you brought up that $1 million overage on 2A.
It's underfunded, yeah.
We weren't aware of that. Can you, Michelle, provide us some information on that? Yeah, it's the first time we heard that. If she can reach out to Paul enough. Okay, and myself. Thanks.
And if there's a serious issue, Rodney, can y'all circle up with Sampo staff? I know we've developed consensus, but if there's something that comes up, I would just hope that y'all would work that out with Sampo staff about what y'all want funded.
Okay.
I also, a brief update on the TAC program. We got the information like at the end of the week last week. The CTV has made their final selection, and Chancellor Park Drive sidewalk was chosen for full funding.
Great.
So congratulations to the county
Congratulations.
for getting that approved.
All right, thank you. All right, next up we have Lana with CMP and PMP.
This is going to be really quick. Just letting you all know about a data update for our performance monitoring program tool. There's going to be a little bit of information about the tool on the left, some information about how to use the tool, and then what our data source is, as well as my email if you have any trouble. Most recent data updates were for Q2 of FY22. So you'll see all of our CMP corridors here. And then each CMP corridor will have weekday congestion, speed, travel time index, weekend congestion percent, speed, travel time index, available for each quarter and each corridor. Again, if you have any trouble using the tool, just send me an email. It's available on this side. We also have the data available in Excel format rather than just a visual.
All right.
Yep.
Quick question for you. Since this is a public forum, tell the group why we should actually care about this information.
It allows for trend analysis from quarter to quarter on the CMP corridors, and since those are focuses of congestion mitigation, it just gives us a better idea of what's going on over time.
And we are required to monitor the congestion on the corridors in the CMP. And if I'm correct, it's because of the TMA in Stafford that we are required to do this. So this is part of our work for the TMA in Stafford. Why we say to you it costs us extra money to have a TMA, well, that's this. This is one of the projects which we wouldn't have to do if we didn't have the TMA. It would be optional. Now we have to do it because of the TMA, and so Lana does it for us and puts the data there so you can monitor the congestion on the roads. We are showing you that we are monitoring the congestion and hopefully the mitigation measures, which are a little more difficult to monitor.
All right. Thank you. Hire. Intern on the spot. All right, FY23, UPWP. I think it's a tag team.
Great. This is Becky and I. And all that I will say before Becky walks you through it is a work in progress because literally from the date we press go on the email to send you this draft, the changes started arriving in my inbox from all of our state partners. We don't even have the 5303 estimate from DRPT yet. So we're using last year's estimate because we don't even have a number. VDOT's given us numbers, thankfully, but they've changed 3 times. So this is a rough idea of what the UPWP is going to look like.
Great. Well, I think we'll have to go through. I've got the highlights here, and this is in your packet. And I just want to give the high-level highlights to me anyway for having done this. And then Ian will help with one of those. The first of importance is the inclusion of the new FY23 Freight Summit. We've spoken at length about that. The second I'm excited about is the Transit Strategic Plan that we've acknowledged that effort in here as well. The third is the FAMPO Vision Plan, and when I finish with a couple other more of the updates, I'll hand it over to Ian to explain the feedback we've received from Policy Committee and where that is. And then number 4, I think in order of importance from my perspective, and Carrie Barber and Jordan brought this up, worked with VDOT to update the VDOT FAMPO transportation model, particularly including the impacts of the Harry Nice US Route 301 bridge widening over the Potomac River, and of course our partners in King George and Caroline. That model is all-inclusive of 5 jurisdictions and a great effort to be done. Lastly, the 2 big studies that are underway, the East-West Mobility Study and the VCR Trail Study. Carrie Barber is the project manager on that. With that, if I've left out anything, staff or Ian, and maybe I'll turn it over to you to talk about the vision plans.
Thanks. Yeah, the idea is that I just would like us to develop a short vision document for FAMPO. Part of what we do so many things, and sometimes we get very deep down in the weeds of, is it $102,000? Is it this money for that project? And we get very project focused, and we get very much in the weeds of what we do. And we've not taken a long-term view for a while to say, what is the vision? Now, the long-range transportation plan does do that to an extent. But I wanted to ask the question, what is FAMPO's vision of the future? What would we like 2050 to look like? And so I started month by month talking to the policy committee just at a high level as to what does the future look like? Are we all going to be driving autonomous cars? Are we going to be on bicycles? Where's the future? And now what I'd like to do is bring it down into just a couple-page document as part of our new UPWP saying, what really is our vision? And the next step that I'd like to take is to just have a survey of us, right? The policy committee, the TAC, the CTAC, to just say what is our future vision for FAMPO as a whole? What do we want the future to look like? And so I'll start with a survey, just asking you all, but not a big involved thing like we did last year, just for people who attend our meetings. What do you think FAMPO's vision should be? Just a couple of questions, and then start to build in a little vision statement, a little vision document with what the future should look like. But that's our UPWP. As I said, the numbers in there, the dollar values are all to be confirmed because I don't think many of them is exactly what they're going to look like when you get the final draft next month. But we did want you to have a draft so that if you see any glaring big things, we need to deal with those because we're going to have to bring you the final draft next month at this meeting to recommend to the policy committee. So that's the rough draft of what it's going to look like. The dollar numbers, I promise you, are going to change.
I have a question. As a FAMPO, do you envision in the future, like 30, 50 years ahead?
Do we envision what?
Like in 50 years from now?
Yes.
The way that us, I guess, or Rolls, train, getting money, Uber maybe getting money or something?
Well, that's an important question. It's a very big question. And what I was trying to show in those slides at the policy committee, I encourage you to look at them again, is to say which of these new technologies is likely to succeed and which is likely to fail. And of course, that's a guess, right? It's Ian Ollis's personal guess. But it's based on lots of studies at MIT and Harvard and Princeton, other universities as to what's likely to happen. And I mean, Uber and Lyft, the price is going to have to go up or they're going to run out of money. That's the big thing there, is that they are not profitable generally across the globe, not just Uber and Lyft. If you go to any of the local homegrown alternatives in other countries, they're all bankrupt. They're all the same. So I don't think that they will last unless they put the prices up substantially. The drivers want medical and pension. They want to be paid. Otherwise, they're not going to do it for very long. So I think that there's a financial problem there. autonomous vehicles, it's going to be very difficult to make them 100% autonomous because of the legal problems involved. So they're going to be partially autonomous, I think, in the future. I could go on, but there's a whole lot of slides I put in the policy committee pack over the last 4 or 5 months as to all of these trends and what I think is going to happen out there. And then our vision is, how do we respond to what's going to happen out there? What do we want to do about that? Do we want to put up more electric charging stations for cars? Do we want more trains? I mean, one of the things I'd like to suggest to VRE, and they'll have a complete meltdown when I say this, but I would like to electrify this train line from DC to Richmond. And you can see already they're going to have a meltdown because of the cost. But that's the way to fix it. Anyway, I'm just answering Kasam's question. Thank you.
Any other questions?
If you do see any problems with the general structure, do let me know. If you see a problem with the dollar value, hang fire. We're working on the dollar values. But if it's a structural problem, there's an item there you don't think should be there, or one that's missing, tell me. But if you think the dollar value is wrong, I agree with you. The dollar value is wrong.
All right, trying to stick close to time. Carrie, you got the RWP?
Just a brief verbal update. So the RWP is our funding formula for working with the rural counties. It's basically finished. We've got it in draft form now. We've met with both King George and Caroline and determined their most pressing transportation planning needs for the next year. So I'm going to be presenting that draft next month to the GWRC. And that's basically
It's not a FAMPA product, but we just inform you so that you know what's going on. We have got a UPWP for the rural counties. It's called the Rural Work Program. Carrie puts it together, and we work quite hard with the localities to design what the projects are they want us to work on in the Rural Work Program, and we've done that this year. So now they're just refining, doing the same thing as we're doing to the UPWP. They're next door doing to the RWP.
All right, last item or major item on the agenda, the bipartisan infrastructure law.
So, thank you. I was asked to just do a short presentation on this, and we're going to send you the slides, but you've got a printed copy in front of you that you can take home with you. These 3 funding streams, one is new, and the other 2 are rolled over in the new infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law, or IIJA. It changes names depending on who you're talking to. It's the mega funding stream, the infra funding stream, and the rural funding stream. And there you can see the dollar values that are being made available in this financial, in this year to construct massive projects. And the deadline for your submission for these 3 is May the 23rd. A notice of funding opportunity was published for these 3 simultaneously. Next slide. That just tells you that the bipartisan infrastructure law has now made additional funding available for these and rolled over some of these grants from previous years. The aim of the grants, there it is. Highways, bridges, intercity, passenger rail, railway, highway up. Grade separation, wildlife crossings, public transportation, marine, highway, and freight and multimodal projects, or groups of projects, or national or regional significant projects, as well as projects to improve and expand the surface transportation infrastructure in rural areas. So one of those specifically focuses on rural areas. Next slide. The scoring criteria, there you have them. Freight movement, job creation, safety, and all that kind of thing. Also some additional considerations, including demonstrated project readiness, which is one of our difficulties in applying for such a big grant. The project has to be ready. Slide. Looking at previous projects that were funded in these funding streams, the costs are between 20 million and 400 million per project, right? So we're not talking about small projects. We're talking about things bigger than smart scale. Awards are between $5 million and $70 million from these grants for that project per award. And some of the projects have got more than one award. so you can get a rural award and you can also get an infra or whatever award. You can get multiple awards for one project. There's examples there, and the actual notes in the links, and as I said, we'll make the slides available to you on email. Next slide. Okay, from the back of the room, that's hard to read, but what I put in the red there are projects that we could hypothetically be eligible for. The other ones that I'm suggesting we're unlikely to be eligible for in our region right now, just at the moment. So MPOs are allowed to apply. Sorry, this is the who can apply. MPOs can apply. A unit of local government, such as a county, can apply. An MPO that serves a UZA. Basically, any body in this room, I think, any organization in this room could essentially apply, I think. Next slide. VDOT can also apply. There it just tells you can use the grants for up to 60% of the future total eligible project costs, including development costs. And as you can see there, some of those also qualify for a rural grant if they've got an infra or mega grant. They connect multiple grants to build these very big projects. And in rural, you can go up to 100% of the project costs can come out of the grant. So, Nick, you could get 100% of the money if you had a big project that qualified.
Do you know if it includes like land acquisition?
I believe it includes everything, yeah. It includes development costs even.
Yeah.
Designing the plans to actually build it. Next slide. And there's, again, eligible projects are, I think, ones in this area are the ones up in the red. That's what I was trying to say just now. Down in the bottom, outside of the red are things I don't think we have ready to be eligible. But the ones in the red, if you just scroll up slightly, a highway, a bridge, multimodal, freight system, etc. You can see there, those are projects that we might. So for example, if we wanted to upgrade the I-95 by adding lanes, what's going to happen is the cost is probably, and we'll hear from VDOT soon, because we've applied for such a project, is probably going to be above the 20 million cost of the smart scale likely limit. Building that tunnel under the I-95 is probably going to be a sizable project that probably is going to be too big for a smart scale, but we don't know yet because we don't know the cost. Well, these kinds of grants and maybe the build and raise grants are the kinds of grants that could be used for these mega projects in our region, because the regular smart scale is not going to fly with very massive projects. So I was asked just to present this to tell you what it's about, because they've been announced. There's a notice of calling for projects. These are what these three are. They are these massive mega projects in these three grants. And if we had a project reasonably ready, we could apply and get, as you can see, tens of millions of dollars per project to fund a particular project if we were able to get the approval. And there you can see the maximum and minimum amounts that apply in each case. The question as to what is rural, it defines rural as any area outside an urbanized area with a population of over 200,000. So the thing inside the area of an urban population exceeding 200,000 is classified in these grants as urban, and anything outside of those areas is classified as rural. That's the line. They just make one line in the sand. There's where you find out more information or submit an application if we were to proceed with it. So that's what I was asked, I think, to present, just to let everybody know what these grants are. And as I say, they're very big infrastructure projects that need very big funding. FAMPO could apply for one. any of our 3 jurisdictions could apply for one, VDOT could apply for one, but it's a question of, do you have such a big project? Is it ready to go? In other words, is the preliminary work already done? And then you have to apply by the deadline of the 31st of May and hope that you get the funding.
Ian, would Fanfo outside of North Stamford be considered a rural area for projects?
Well, it doesn't say TMA. It just says an urban area of 200,000. So I don't think they're strictly using the TMA definition. They're using a urbanized area with 200,000. So they're using, I think they're using the Census Bureau's definition, which then Federal Highways turns into the TMAs. So it's a similar sort of calculation, but it doesn't formally refer to the TMAs, so I can't totally answer the question. But it looks to me that other than the TMA, the rest of FAMBO is a rural area according to that definition.
Any other questions for Ian?
The only projects I could think of that would be big enough would be the I-95 related projects, which, I mean,
Change maybe, there's no change that goes to Gordon.
The which?
Interchange at the rest area somewhere there that goes to Gordon.
Yes, if Spotsylvania wanted to build the Harrison Road interchange or the city wanted to build the interchange into Central Park, I guess those would be projects that would be big enough for this kind of funding. But you'd have to have a ready-to-go project, and I don't think either of those two are ready to go from our point of view, I would imagine, by the 31st of May. But I would guess that in the future, if we wanted to proceed with any of those 3 or 4 big projects that we've spoken about, this would be one of the grants I think we'd have to apply to, because we wouldn't get through Smart Scale probably enough funding for big projects like that. But there certainly is funding, and this is how we would, this together with things like raise grants would be the ways that we would get the funding for. I think that, I mean, this is just a quick opinion, right? I'm not the expert on raise grants and other things.
Ian, I'd encourage consideration potentially of the Greenway feasibility work that had been performed by GBRC staff. That's a regionally significant multimodal project that's relatively packaged given the amount of evaluation analysis that went into it. So having been on that stakeholder group, I would just make a recommendation.
Submitting it as one whole project, the whole Greenway thing?
Interesting idea.
That could be interesting. I've never thought of that. That's a very interesting idea.
Including the under I-95 tunnel.
Then we're definitely talking about a $60 million project.
And I guess Stephen or Michelle, do VDOT envision applying for any of these grants at all, or considering any projects?
That usually those types of decisions are made in the central office in Richmond, whether they look at a statewide perspective, and then that is made at the central office level where the VDOT applies for these grants and selects the project.
Please keep us informed if some decide.
Any other comments or questions? All right. Correspondence, I see you've got an item from the Federal Register in there. Is that something staff wanted to speak on?
Which one is that?
This is just a notice that the census has finally chosen the criteria in which they will select and designate urban areas. They have not put an output of these criteria, so there's no maps or no geographic visuals yet. They just said, we received these comments from last year, and we've changed the category maybe slightly a little bit. This is what we're going to move forward with. They haven't produced outputs from what I have found on the website or seen in any notices. But this is just in your packet to review.
The summary of what they've put out is that in some cases they've shifted back from the edge. So they went from what we had in the past to this very, what we considered an extreme view in terms of what's an urban area and all that. In a number of cases, they've pulled back from that extreme to something a little bit closer to what we had previously, but not going all the way back to what we had previously. So in other words, we've now got a middle road in some cases. In 1 or 2 cases, they've stuck to their guns and said, oh, we're going to do what we said we're going to do. So that's the kind of, when you read through it line by line, A bunch they pulled back to like halfway, and a bunch they said, no, we're going to implement them like we said we were going to implement them. So it is going to shrink what is part of the urban areas in the United States. They're going to shrink.
All right, any other questions on this item? See, this is why we need federal workers to come back to work. Okay, staff reports? Are there any staff reports, Mr. Olive?
We don't have any, I don't think new, but I don't think we introduced Coley at the last TAC because she was brand new. So would you like to stand, maybe? Coley Tuzal is our new Title VI and Public Engagement coordinator. She is going to be speaking to you all as time goes on about what's going on in your area and about projects that FAMPA should be aware of on a communications level. So you'll see we've started tweeting and Facebooking again. That's Coley doing it. Welcome. I don't know if you want to say anything, but we just wanted to welcome her to the TAC as well.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, well, welcome aboard. Happy to have you. Hopefully you'll love it and stay here forever.
I do. I love it already.
All right. Yeah, right.
What was that? Yeah.
All right, member reports. Do any member have a report? I won't go around the room. You know who you are. All right. Any other items? All right, again, kudos to Stephen for making the magic happen for all of us. I don't know why you love us, but maybe it's because you just do. Because we had a long Friday, we were just praying.
Let me thank everyone as well. The applicants were terrific. None of you were involved in the Friday afternoon scramble. So I appreciate that. There was one. Thank you, LC.
Thanks for not being part of the problem. We will see y'all next month.
Thanks.